Hello everyone, I'm Georgia and this is The Sound of Georgia. Today I'm going to be talking about Die Trapp Family, which is the German film from the 1950s that was the precursor to The Sound of Music and is essentially the missing link in the Von Trapp story. When it comes to Sound of Music and historical inaccuracy, people love pointing the finger at Rodgers and Hammerstein. They hear, oh, the names were changed and she wasn't really in love with him, and escaping over the mountains, and throw Rodgers and Hammerstein under the bus and scream historical inaccuracy. And while that is true, it's a bit unfair and a lot more complicated. Having read Maria von Trapp's original memoir, Sound of Music is far more historically accurate than people think it is. And I think people like to forget. And yes, she wasn't in love with them when they first got married, but the scene in the movie between Maria and the Baroness is literally straight out of history. And when it comes to things like that, people forget. With that said, while Sound of Music is far more historically accurate than people think, and I will die on that hill, it is definitely fictionalised. A lot. But you don't get from what really happened in history to that level of fictionalisation just like that. You need something in between. Enter Die Trapp Family. I've honestly been saying the title in German pretty much every time I mention this, and I have no idea whether I'm pronouncing it right, but it essentially translates to The Trapp Family. And it was a German film that was made in 1956 after Maria sold the rights to her memoir. They initially offered her $10,000 for the rights to her memoir, and I can't remember exactly why, but eventually they had to downgrade to $9,000. With the caveat that they would pay her in cash. And she agreed, not because she wanted her life to be adapted, but because she needed the money. In addition to that, they told her that as an American citizen, she would not be able to receive any money from it. Which was completely false. She absolutely could have, they just didn't let her. Now, being more or less the precursor to Sound of Music, and we'll get into that in a bit, it follows basically the same plot as Sound of Music does. Just slightly more historically accurate. It starred Ruth, I'm not even going to try and pronounce her surname, it's up here on screen, as Maria, and Hans Holt as the captain. As I said, it was released in 1956, and a couple of years later in 1958 it got a sequel called Die Trapp Family in America, which translates to The Trapp Family in America, and follows what happened to them after they fled Austria. And I haven't actually seen that one. So after it had been released, Mary Martin and her husband Richard Halliday saw the movie and they talked to Rodgers and Hammerstein and said, hey, do you think we can turn this into a musical? Mary Martin had of course worked with Rodgers and Hammerstein before on South Pacific, and she basically wanted them to write the show so she could star in it. And as such, Sound of Music is based on the German film just as much, if not more, than it is based on Maria von Trapp's original memoir. Let's look at the big things people look at Sound of Music and go, historical inaccuracy, and see where Die Trapp Family lines up with that. So the first one is the names. So in Sound of Music, I'm sure we all know their names, Liesel, Friedrich, Louisa, Kurt, Brigitte, Martha and Gretel. But in real life, and you may already know this if you've watched other videos on my channel, the original 7 Von Trapp children were named in order: Rupert, Agatha, Maria, Werner, Hedwig, Joanna and Martina. And people always go, oh, historical inaccuracy. But the Trapp Family did this too. Now, with the second oldest daughter's name being Maria, that would seem to be the obvious reason you would change the names of the children. If we kept their original names, we'd have 2 characters called Maria that are running around. And that could get a bit confusing. Especially when one of those characters is our protagonist. But Die Trapp Family didn't change the children's names in that way. In Die Trapp Family, the children's names are, in order, Rupert, Agatha, Maria, Werner, Hedwig, Rosemary and Martina. So they only changed one, and it wasn't the one you would think would be the reason behind changing their names. Okay. I honestly don't know why they did this. As I said, if there was one name you were going to change, it would be Maria. And obviously with Rodgers and Hammerstein they went, okay, we can't have 2 Marias, So we'll change her, which means we're better off changing everyone. But the Trapp family only changed one, and it wasn't Maria. Now, the name Rosemary didn't just come out of nowhere. It was the name of Maria's first daughter, who actually died very, very recently, RIP. But I still don't get why they did it. Changing the names, or name, like this honestly makes less sense than what Rodgers and Hammerstein did. Then again, I don't actually think she's mentioned by name in the film more than once. So given the somewhat confusing way they changed this, I'm going to say no, this is not the main reason Rodgers and Hammerstein decided to change everyone's names. Rodgers and Hammerstein definitely changed everybody's names so there were two Marias, which does not seem to be why the German film changed everybody's names. Moving on to the timeline. Another thing people love to point out as being historically inaccurate about Sound of Music is the timeline. In reality, Marie Kitschera arrived at the Von Trapp Villa in 1926, and she and the captain were married in late 1927. But it was only a decade later, in 1938, that the family fled Austria. Sound of Music accessed the 11 years that happened in between, which included the birth of Maria and the captain's two daughters, their bankruptcy, and, the formation of the singing group. The way the singing group came about is not the way it happened in Sound of Music. And then it sandwiches the events that happened in 1926 and 1927 together, has them take place in 1938, all in the span of a few months. But once again, this doesn't seem as drastic when you look at the German film. The events in the Trapp family happen over a longer period of time, but not that much longer. Instead of cutting out several years in the middle and having it all take place within a few months the year they escaped, the German film just sets it a decade later. So the German film starts in 1936, and so it has the major events that took place over those interim 11 years and has them play out over the course of about 18 months. This means Maria's daughters are sacrificed, but we still get the bankruptcy, and the formation of the singing group is far closer to what it was in reality. And honestly, compressing it this way actually really works for dramatic purposes. And with this story, you can actually compress it down to 18 months and still get pretty much all the big events. Yes, you end up sacrificing the children, but that's about it. There are a lot of uneventful moments that happen over the course of a decade after all, and you don't need to include every single one of them. Hacking 10 years off simply by having the story start an exact decade later actually makes a lot of sense. And with Sound of Music's focus going more to everything happening before Maria and the captain got married, you could see why they would want to condense this again. And so Sound of Music changed it again. So Rodgers and Hammerstein compressing the timeline the way they did, I'm going to say is yes, partly because of the way the German film did it. Next up is love, and I think this is kind of in the middle. The relationship between Maria and the captain, specifically when it comes to romance, is not quite as dramatised as Sound of Music does, but probably more than it was in real life. And I think that fact alone kind of proves my point for the video. It really is the missing link. But I don't think upping the romance is something Rodgers and Hammerstein really did strictly because of the German film, but more so that it's just something that would happen in a film like this. In reality, after she came back from the Abbey and found out she had to marry him, she was sobbing. In Sound of Music, they're completely in love, and then in the German film, it's kind of in the middle. She arrives back and she doesn't seem in any way sad that the nuns have told her she has to marry him. Upping the romance just makes for a better story in general. So obviously the Trapp family did that, and then Rodgers and Hammerstein did it again. Moving on, this might be the big one, and that is the escape. The climbing over the mountain thing to Switzerland is all Rodgers and Hammerstein, and I'm not sure why. Probably to link back to Climb Every Mountain as a song. Rodgers and Hammerstein originally wanted to end the story in Ellis Island, which is actually where the German film ends. But instead they went with climbing over the mountain to Switzerland, even though if they had climbed over the mountain, they would not have ended up in Switzerland, but would have ended right up at Eagle's Nest. I've been to Eagle's Nest. You can see where they shot the final scene in the movie from Eagle's Nest. They would most definitely have not been in Switzerland. In the German film, they just say they're going for a walk in the mountains, and that's as much detail as we get. And so quickly, just another few fictionalization things that may have come from the German film. In reality, Maria was hired to be a tutor for little Maria, who could not go to school because she was sick. And in Sound of Music, obviously, she's the governess. In the Trapp Family, she's the governess, which just makes more sense with the story like that. Having her be a tutor for one of the children puts said child under a bit of a spotlight. Whereas if she's the governess, they're all about equal. Also, the Lonely Goatherd puppet show was almost certainly taken from the German film. In the opening credits of the film, it says they partially used an idea from Georg Hördeleg, hope I'm pronouncing that right, who was the director of the German film. Just as in history, in the German film, we have Princess Yvonne arrive at the villa as the captain's prospective bride, and the children put on a little shadow puppet show for her. This is almost certainly where Rodgers and Hammerstein got the idea for the puppet show. There is also a thunderstorm sing-along scene in the German film, but considering a thunderstorm sing-along scene also exists in the stage version, whereas the puppet show does not, this is almost certainly the partial idea. Really, I cannot say whether Sound of Music fictionalized things the way it did 100% because of the Trapp Family, or whether it's just the next step for fictionalization of this particular story in a general sense. By that I mean I don't know whether it would have been all that different if it was based simply on Maria's memoir. Usually when it comes to adaptations of historical events, the further you get from when they happened, the more fictionalized they become. Although, with Sound of Music getting so much criticism for being historically inaccurate, all of the adaptations of the Von Trapp story succeeding it are a bit more historically accurate than Sound of Music was. Almost as if they're trying to say, this is what really happened, Sound of Music had it wrong. Rodgers and Hammerstein did indeed change a lot from what most people would think is Sound of Music source material. But when you look at the Trapp Family, it doesn't seem quite as drastic. As I said, Sound of Music is based on the German film just as much, but probably more so than it is the original memoir. And when you look at it that way, they didn't actually change all that much. Besides, it's not the first time Rodgers and Hammerstein has done something like this. The King and I came out a full 8 years before Sound of Music did, and it tells the story of Annalee and Owens and King Mongkut of Siam, but it's based more on Margaret Landon's fictionalized story, Anna and the King of Siam, more than it is based on Anna's memoirs. And that's everything I've got for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Stay safe, feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my video next time. So long for a while!